Hey guys, tonight we aren't walking through the grand halls of palaces or recounting the strategies of victorious battlefields. Our journey takes a different path, one that leads away from the light and into the shadows of the past. We are descending, step by quiet step, into the cold, stone dungeons and echoing market squares of the medieval world. Here, in the damp, chill, and flickering torchlight, we'll uncover some of its most terrifying creations, not of war, but of what they call justice. But this is a journey of the mind, and you are safe here. So, if this kind of storytelling helps you unwind, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it truly brings you peace. Now, get comfortable. Let the world settle around you and dim the lights. Let the worries of your day fade, because we are separated by centuries from the horrors we are about to witness. There is nothing to fear, just the gentle cadence of history, here to soothe you into rest. Before we look at the devices themselves, let's take a moment to understand the world that created them. It's easy for us, in our modern comfort, to look back and see only senseless cruelty. But for the people of the Middle Ages, there was a logic to it, a grim, terrifying logic, but logic nonetheless. Imagine a world without a police force as we know it. There were no patrol cars, no detectives, no vast network of forensics. In most towns and villages, law and order were maintained not by investigation, but by fear. Fear was the ultimate deterrent. Justice, therefore, had to be a public spectacle. It needed to be seen, to be heard, to be smelled. The goal wasn't to rehabilitate a criminal. It was to brand an unforgettable warning onto the minds of everyone who watched. A public execution, a day spent in the stocks. These were not just punishments for one person, they were lessons for the entire community, a raw and brutal form of civic education. And towering over this landscape of earthly justice was the immense authority of the Church. In the medieval mind, law and morality were inseparable. The will of God and the will of the king were often seen as one and the same. A crime against your neighbor was a sin, but a crime against the church heresy, blasphemy. Witchcraft was a tear in the very fabric of reality. It was a rebellion against God himself. And for such profound crimes, the punishments had to be equally profound. Torture and execution in these cases were often framed as a twisted form of mercy. The body had to be broken, burned, and destroyed, not just for retribution, but to purify the soul, to save it from eternal damnation, even as it was subjected to hell on earth. This belief system bled into the very process of justice. The concept of being innocent until proven guilty was a distant dream. In many cases, an accusation alone was enough to cast a shadow of guilt. Torture, then, became a legitimate tool for investigation. It was not always intended to kill, but to extract the one thing that was seen as the ultimate proof, a confession. The devices were engineered with a chilling intimacy, designed not just to inflict pain, but to systematically dismantle a person's will. They were instruments meant to break the mind as much as the body, to make a person confess to anything, true or not, just to make the agony stop. And finally, it's crucial to remember that this was a world of rigid hierarchy. Justice was rarely blind. A nobleman and a peasant accused of the same crime would face vastly different fates. A person of high birth might be granted a swift, honorable death by the sword. It was seen as a privilege. The commoner, the poor, the outcast, they were reserved for the rope, the fire, and the most agonizing, drawn-out spectacles of pain. The punishment wasn't just for the crime, it was a brutal reinforcement of your place in the world. It was a final, horrifying reminder that in the eyes of medieval law, not all souls were created equal. And it is in this world, a world of public fear, divine judgment, and fractured justice, that our story truly begins. It is from this soil that the instruments we are about to witness grew. Our first stop is in the heart of the village, the bustling market square. Amidst the sounds of merchants haggling and children playing, stands a simple wooden structure. It's unassuming, almost crude in its construction, but it is one of the most powerful symbols of medieval justice. We're looking at the stocks and the pillory. They are often confused, but their function was slightly different. The stocks, low to the ground, were a set of wooden boards with holes to clamp the ankles. The victim would be forced to sit on a low bench, or even on the cold, damp ground, with their feet trapped. The pillory was its more humiliating cousin. It stood upright, a tall post with a hinged wooden frame at the top, with holes for the head and the hands. Trapped in the pillory, a person was forced to stand, exposed and helpless, their face and upper body on full display for all to see. These weren't instruments of extreme physical pain, not at first glance. They were reserved for lesser crimes, petty theft, public drunkenness, a baker who sold a dishonest loaf of bread, a merchant who cheated a customer. But the true torture of the stocks and pillory wasn't inflicted by the wood itself. It was inflicted by the community. Imagine being locked in place, unable to move, unable to shield yourself. The day would begin, and the market would fill with people you knew. Your friends, your neighbors, the people you saw at church. And now, they are your tormentors. The first jeers would begin, then laughter. Someone might throw a piece of rotting fruit, then mud, dung, dead animals, or rocks. You couldn't wipe the filth from your face or swat away the flies that gathered. You were utterly, completely vulnerable. The hours would crawl by. The sun might beat down on you, or a cold rain could soak you to the bone. Your muscles would scream from being held in one unnatural position. Your ankles would swell. Your wrists would chafe raw against the wood. But worse than the physical discomfort was the crushing weight of public shame. Every laugh, every insult was a blow. It was a process of dehumanization, turning a person into an object of public amusement and scorn. And the punishment didn't end when the boards were unlocked. The memory of that day would linger. The stench of shame would cling to you long after the filth was washed away. You would walk through the same streets, past the same faces, and you would always be the person who was in the pillory. It was a scar left not on the skin, but on your reputation. A constant reminder of your transgression. A simple wooden device that held the power to strip away a person's dignity, one agonizing hour at a time. While the stocks and pillory were tools of general public shaming, our next device was designed with a chilling specificity. It was not for thieves or drunkards. It was a punishment aimed almost exclusively at women, for a crime that today we would not even recognize as such, the crime of speaking too freely. This was the scold's bridle, sometimes known as the branks. Picture a cage forged from cold, heavy iron, designed to fit entirely over a person's head. It was a grotesque helmet of humiliation, but its true horror lay inside. Attached to the front of the cage was a small plate of iron, a bit, often covered with sharp spikes or a serrated edge. This bit was designed to be forced into the mouth, pressing down hard upon the tongue. Once the bridle was locked in place, the victim could not speak. Any attempt to move her tongue would result in it being pierced or lacerated by the spikes. She was rendered utterly silent, capable only of muffled, agonizing groans. The term scold was a vague and powerful accusation in the medieval and early modern periods. A woman could be branded a scold for arguing with her husband, for gossiping with neighbors, for challenging a merchant, or simply for having an opinion that inconvenienced a man in power. The bridle was the physical manifestation of a society that feared the female voice. It was a tool to enforce silence, to literally and figuratively put a woman back in her place. The punishment was, like the pillory, a public parade of shame. After the bridle was fitted, the woman would be led by a chain through the streets of her own town. Sometimes a bell was attached to the device, its ringing announcing her approach, drawing windows open and people into the streets. Imagine the scene, the clanking of the iron cage, the rhythmic toll of the bell, and the silent, weeping woman being led like an animal. She couldn't plead her case. She couldn't cry out for mercy. She couldn't even explain. She was simply a spectacle of silenced defiance. The onlookers' reactions would have been a mixture of morbid curiosity, pity, and perhaps grim satisfaction. The bridle served as a potent warning to other women in the crowd. This is the price of a sharp tongue. This is the consequence of stepping outside the quiet, subservient role prescribed for you. After hours of this agonizing parade, the bridle would be removed. The physical wounds in her mouth would eventually heal, but like the pillory, the psychological scars would remain. It was a punishment that aimed to break the spirit, to teach a woman that her voice was a weapon that could and would be used against her. The scold's bridle was not just an instrument of torture. It was an instrument of control, a brutal piece of iron designed to silence half the population, one painful, humiliating step at a time. Some punishments were designed to fade. The bruises would heal. The humiliation might eventually lessen. But our next instrument left a mark that could never be erased. It was a sentence etched not in a record book, but directly onto the flesh of the condemned. We are talking about the branding iron. The process was brutally simple, a ritual of fire and pain. Imagine a blacksmith's forge, the coals glowing with an intense orange heat. Resting in those coals is a heavy iron rod, its end forged into a specific letter or symbol. T for a thief, voleur in French. F for a forger, or felon. V for a vagabond. In some places, the symbol was more elaborate, like the fleur-de-lis in France, a mark of the state's ownership over the criminal. The condemned would be restrained, their arm, shoulder, or sometimes even their cheek, held steady. The brander, often the town executioner, would retrieve the iron from the fire. For a moment, it would illuminate the grim scene, glowing with a terrifying heat that you could feel from feet away, and then it would be pressed firmly against the skin. The sound is one that would haunt your nightmares, a sharp, sickening hiss as the hot iron seared through layers of skin. The smell of burning flesh would fill the air, thick and acrid. The pain would be instantaneous and blinding, a white-hot explosion that would overwhelm every other sense. But the iron's work was not done in that initial moment of agony. When the brand was pulled away, It left behind a perfect, blackened wound in the shape of the letter. This was not a simple burn. It was a third-degree burn, destroying the tissue completely. And this was the point. The wound would eventually heal, but it would not heal cleanly. It would form a thick, raised, permanent scar, a keloid, that would forever be a visible declaration of their crime. This was the true purpose of the branding iron. It was a lifelong label. A branded man could never truly escape his past. He could move to a new town, try to start a new life, but his secret was always there, just beneath the fabric of his shirt. If he was ever arrested again, the brand was immediate proof of his history. It made finding honest work nearly impossible. Who would hire a man marked as a thief? It made forming new relationships, earning trust, a constant struggle. The brand isolated him, marking him as an outcast, a member of a permanent criminal underclass. It was a punishment that turned the human body into a walking document of its own shame. Every morning when he dressed, he would see it. Every time he caught a stranger's glance lingering a moment too long, he would feel it. The branding iron didn't just punish a crime once. It was a sentence that was relived every single day, a constant, silent reminder, burned into the skin, that society had judged you and would never, ever let you forget. The devices we've seen so far, the stocks, the bridle, the branding iron, were primarily tools of public punishment and identification. But now we enter a darker space, the interrogation chamber. Here, the goal was not public shame, but private agony, inflicted to extract a single, precious commodity, a confession. And in this realm, one of the simplest yet most effective tools was the thumbscrew. At first glance, it doesn't look like much. It's a small, portable device, often made of iron, consisting of 2 or more bars connected by a large screw. It was a vice, but not for wood or metal. It was a vice for human flesh and bone. The victim's thumbs, and sometimes their fingers or even their big toes, would be placed between the bars. The interrogator would then begin to turn the screw. The pressure would start slowly, a dull ache that would quickly sharpen into a piercing, unbearable pain. The metal bars would bite into the flesh, compressing it against the bone. As the screw was tightened further, the first layer of the thumb would be flattened, then the second. The victim would feel the pressure building, an immense, localized force that felt like their entire body was being focused into that one small point of contact. The interrogator would often work in concert with a scribe. They would ask a question and turn the screw. Wait for an answer. If the answer was unsatisfactory, they would turn it again. It was a terrifying rhythm of question and pain. Question and pain. The slow, deliberate creak of the turning screw would become the most dreaded sound in the world. If the victim still refused to confess, the interrogator would continue turning. The pressure would become so immense that the bones themselves would begin to fracture. First, a spider web of tiny cracks. Then, a complete, shattering break. The bones in the tips of the thumbs would be utterly pulverized, reduced to little more than fragments within a sack of mangled flesh. The genius of the thumbscrew, from the torturer's perspective, was its precision. It caused excruciating, disabling pain, but it rarely killed the victim. They could be kept on the very edge of consciousness, their mind entirely consumed by the agony in their hands, making them willing to say anything, confess to any crime, Name any accomplice just to make it stop. Even if the victim survived and was eventually released, their hands would be ruined for life. They would be left with mangled digits, unable to grip a tool, hold a pen, or even feed themselves properly. It was a constant physical reminder of their time in the chamber. The thumbscrew was a masterpiece of cruel efficiency, a small device that could generate a universe of pain and systematically crush a person's will, one turn at a time. The interrogation chamber had many ways to inflict pain. Some were complex, others, like the one we turn to now, were brutally simple in their design. It required no intricate machinery, just a rope, a pulley, and a high ceiling. This method was known by many names: the rope, the hoist, or most commonly, the strappado. The process began with the victim's hands being tied securely behind their back. The end of the rope was then looped around their bound wrists and thrown over a pulley attached to a beam high above. The torturer, or his assistant, would then begin to pull on the other end of the rope, hoisting the person off the ground. Instantly, the full weight of their body would be concentrated on their wrists and shoulder joints. A searing pain would rip through their arms as their shoulders were forced into a completely unnatural position. The muscles would strain. The ligaments would stretch to their breaking point, and then, with a series of sickening pops and clicks, the shoulder joints would dislocate. The humerus bone would be wrenched from the glenoid socket, leaving the arm hanging limp, held on only by muscle and skin. This alone was agonizing, a pain so intense it would cause many to pass out. But the strappado had a second, even more brutal phase. After being suspended in this excruciating position, often while being questioned, the victim would be subjected to the drop. The torturer would suddenly release the tension on the rope, letting them fall several feet, only to jerk them to a sudden, violent stop just before they hit the floor. The shock of this sudden stop was unimaginable. It sent a wave of force through the already dislocated joints, tearing muscles, ripping ligaments, and sometimes even fracturing bones. It was a full body convulsion of pure agony. This process could be repeated multiple times, hoisting them up, letting the pain burn, and then dropping them again and again, until a confession was obtained or the victim lost consciousness entirely. The strappado was a favorite of inquisitors, as it was brutally effective and, crucially, it rarely left external marks. A victim could be subjected to this torment, have their shoulders completely destroyed, and yet show few outward signs of injury besides some chafing on their wrists. One of the most famous groups subjected to this torture were the Knights Templar, the wealthy and powerful military order accused of heresy in the early 14th century. Historical records detail how knights were repeatedly put to the strappado to force them to confess to worshiping false idols and spitting on the cross. Even after the ordeal was over, the damage was permanent. The shoulders would be ruined, the arms often rendered useless for life. It was a punishment that left the victim physically broken, a constant reminder of the moment their own body was turned against them. Using nothing more than gravity and a simple length of rope. There is a name that echoes through the darkest corridors of history, a name that has become synonymous with torture itself, the rack. It was not a tool of haste or passion. It was an instrument of slow, inexorable, and soul-shattering torment designed with one purpose in mind: to literally pull a person apart. Imagine a large, rectangular wooden frame, built low to the ground like a crude bed. At each end of the frame, there were wooden rollers equipped with ratchets and handles. The victim would be laid upon this frame, often stripped of their clothing, vulnerable and exposed in the cold, damp air of the dungeon. Their wrists would be fastened with ropes to the rollers at one end and their ankles to the rollers at the other. They were spread-eagled, immobilized, a living component in a machine of pain. The torturer, calm and methodical, would stand at one end and begin to turn the handles. The rollers would slowly rotate, tightening the ropes. At first, the sensation would just be an uncomfortable stretching. But with each click of the ratchet, the tension would increase, pulling the limbs in opposite directions. The muscles in the arms and legs would tighten into knots, screaming in protest. The pain would build from a dull ache into a fire that consumed their entire body. Consider the story of a man named Thomas, a minor nobleman from the 14th century, accused of plotting against his king. He vehemently denied the charge, but his pleas of innocence were meaningless here. He was dragged to the dungeon, thrown roughly onto the rack, and bound. As the interrogator posed his questions, the assistant would turn the cranks. "Did you conspire to overthrow the monarch?" Thomas would scream his innocence, his voice echoing off the stone walls. The crank would turn again. He would feel his joints begin to pop, a sickening sound that was both heard and felt deep within his bones. His shoulders would be the first to go, the head of the humerus bone tearing from its socket with a gut-wrenching crunch. The pain would be blinding, but the torturer would not stop. He would keep turning the handles, ratcheting up the tension. Next would be the elbows, then the hips, the knees. He would hear the sound of his own tendons snapping like overtuned lute strings, his ligaments ripping like wet parchment. The goal of the skilled torturer was to draw this process out, to keep the victim alive and conscious for as long as possible, suspended in a state of perpetual agony. They would be stretched beyond their natural limits, their body elongating by several inches. In some historical accounts, victims were stretched so far that their joints were completely dislocated, their bodies rent limb from limb. For Thomas, the end of his resistance came when the pain became his entire world. Nothing else existed. Not his innocence, not his family, not his king. Only the fire in his joints and the chilling, deliberate creak of the machine that was unmaking him. With a choking sob, he confessed. He admitted to everything they wanted to hear, inventing details, naming names, desperate for the torment to end. His confession, extracted under these brutal circumstances, sealed his fate. He was dragged from the rack, a broken and bloody ruin of a man, and taken to the executioner's block. The rack had done its job. It had not discovered the truth. It had manufactured it. It was a vile apparatus whose power lay in its ability to make a person say anything, to betray anyone, to condemn themselves, simply to halt the slow, mechanical, and agonizing journey of being pulled apart. This next device has a deceptively simple, almost rustic name, the wooden donkey, or sometimes the Spanish donkey. But there is nothing gentle about this beast. It was an instrument of excruciating pain, designed to inflict a very specific and terrible type of injury. Picture a sawhorse, like one a carpenter might use. But instead of a flat top, its central spine was a sharp, triangular wedge of wood or iron, honed to a cruel angle. This was the donkey's back, The victim, completely stripped, would be forced to ride this donkey, positioned as if on horseback, with one leg on either side of the sharp spine. The initial pain would be intense as the wedge bit into the flesh of the crotch. But the true torture was yet to come. The victim's own body weight was the primary source of agony, channeling all their mass onto that one sharp line. To prevent them from falling off, their hands were often tied behind their back, forcing them to remain upright. And then the torturers would add more weight. Heavy stones, cannonballs, or blocks of iron would be chained to the victim's ankles. With each weight that was added, the downward pressure would increase, pulling them harder onto the unforgiving spine of the donkey. The pain is difficult to fully comprehend. The sharp wedge would be slowly, relentlessly, forcing its way upwards into the body. The goal was as simple as it was gruesome to saw the person in half, from the groin upwards, using their own weighted body as the force. It was a process of gradual, agonizing bifurcation. This torture was often used on soldiers for insubordination or on women accused of witchcraft, the nature of the device having a particularly cruel and violating symbolism for them. Imagine a young woman accused of consorting with demons, hoisted onto this wooden beast in a cold dungeon. The jeers of her accusers would echo around her as the first weights were attached to her feet. She would feel a pain that was both sharp and tearing, a pressure that seemed to want to split her very being. With each added stone, the wedge would press deeper. She would struggle to breathe, every muscle tensed against the agony, but there was no escape. The more she struggled, the more the sharp edge would tear at her. The process could be drawn out for hours, the torturers adding weight incrementally to prolong the suffering, demanding a confession as the price for a quicker, though no less horrifying, end. The wooden donkey was a machine of pure, primitive brutality. It required no complex gears or levers, just a basic understanding of weight, pressure, and the breaking points of the human body. It was a device that didn't just cause pain. It was designed to tear a person apart from their most vulnerable point. A slow, agonizing journey into oblivion. Not all torture was about crushing bones or tearing flesh. Some of the most diabolical instruments were designed to create a prison out of the victim's own body. They inflicted pain not through movement, but through the absolute prevention of it. Such was the case with the heretic's fork. This device was deceptively simple, yet its design was pure psychological cruelty. It consisted of a short metal rod with two sharp, fork-like prongs at each end, like two pitchforks welded together at the base. This fork was then attached to a thick leather collar that was strapped tightly around the victim's neck. When fitted, one set of sharp prongs rested firmly against the bone of the upper chest, the sternum, while the other set pressed into the soft, sensitive flesh underneath the chin. The points did not pierce the skin, not at first. They simply rested there, a constant, threatening presence. The victim was then typically chained to a wall, often standing, so they could not lie down. And then they were left alone in the darkness. The torture of the heretic's fork was the agony of inches, of micro-movements. If the victim's head drooped even slightly from exhaustion, the prongs under their chin would dig into their throat. If they tried to lift their head to relieve the pressure, the bottom prongs would press into their chest. Sleep was impossible. The moment they began to drift off, their head would naturally relax and lower, jolting them awake with a stab of sharp pain. They were trapped in a state of forced, perpetual wakefulness. The muscles in their neck and shoulders would burn with exhaustion, locked in a constant state of tension to avoid the fork's bite. Days would blur into one another. The victim, deprived of sleep, would begin to lose their grip on reality. The darkness of the cell would play tricks on their mind. They would start to hallucinate, seeing figures in the shadows, hearing voices that weren't there. Their will would be slowly eroded, not by a sudden, violent assault, but by the relentless, monotonous, and maddening inability to find a single moment of rest or comfort. It was primarily used, as its name suggests, on those accused of heresy. The symbolism was potent. A heretic was someone who had strayed from the straight path of doctrine, and their punishment was to be physically forced into a posture of rigid, unyielding attention, unable to even bow their head in prayer or submission. A confession obtained under these conditions was not a product of truth, but of a mind pushed beyond the absolute limits of human endurance. The heretic's fork was a tool that attacked the mind by imprisoning the body, a slow, quiet descent into madness, one sleepless hour at a time. Water. It is the substance of life, something we instinctively seek for comfort and survival. But in the twisted logic of the interrogation chamber, even this most basic element could be turned into a tool of unbearable agony. The methods were varied, but they are known collectively as water torture, and they created the horrifying sensation of drowning while on dry land. One of the most common methods was known as the water cure. The victim would be strapped down to a board or a ladder, their head lower than their feet. Their mouth would be forced open, often with a piece of iron or cloth. A funnel would then be placed in their mouth, and the torturer would begin to pour water or sometimes other foul liquids like urine directly down their throat. The feeling would be one of instant panic. The stomach would fill rapidly, distending to an agonizing degree, creating a painful, bloating pressure that felt like it would tear them apart from the inside. The natural gag reflex would be overwhelmed, and the victim would feel a terrifying sense of suffocation as water filled their esophagus and threatened to enter their lungs. It was a slow, controlled drowning. They couldn't breathe. They couldn't scream. They could only feel their body being unnaturally filled, fighting for air against a relentless flood. Another, perhaps even more psychologically cruel method, involved a piece of cloth. A thin, porous rag would be placed over the victim's mouth and nose. The torturer would then begin to slowly drip water onto it. With each breath the victim took, they would inhale the water-soaked fabric, which would cling to the inside of their mouth and the back of their throat. This simulated the sensation of drowning with terrifying precision. Each desperate gasp for air would only draw the wet cloth tighter, pulling more water into their airway. It was a pure, primal terror. The brain, convinced it was drowning, would trigger every survival instinct, but there was no escape. The process could be stopped and started, the cloth removed and then reapplied, dragging out the ordeal for hours, breaking down the victim's will through repeated cycles of near suffocation. This form of torture was particularly insidious because it left almost no physical marks. A person could be brought to the brink of death, their mind shattered by the repeated experience of drowning, and yet their body would appear unharmed. It was seen as a cleaner method of interrogation, a way to extract a confession without the overt brutality of the rack or the branding iron. But for the person on the board, it was anything but clean. It was a descent into a suffocating, watery hell, where every desperate fight for life only pulled them deeper into the abyss. In the strange and often contradictory world of medieval law, a trial could not always proceed without the accused person entering a plea. They had to say the words guilty or not guilty. To stand mute, to refuse to answer the court, was to grind the gears of justice to a halt. For this act of defiance, a special torment was reserved. It was known in England as peine forte et dure, strong and hard punishment. It is more commonly known as pressing. The procedure was a slow and brutal descent into suffocation. The victim would be taken to a dungeon and stripped. They would be laid on their back on the cold stone floor. A wooden board, often the size of a door, would be placed on top of their chest and stomach. And then the weights would be brought in, one by one. Heavy stones or iron weights would be placed upon the board. The pressure would begin to build immediately. At first, it would just be an immense weight, making it difficult to breathe. The executioner would ask, again and again, "Do you plead?" Silence would be met with another stone. As more weight was added, the victim's ribs would begin to strain under the load. The air would be forced from their lungs in shallow, desperate gasps. The pressure on their internal organs would be immense. It was a slow, agonizing crushing. The goal was not necessarily to kill them, but to force them to speak. If they uttered a plea, the torture would stop. But why would anyone choose this horrifying fate over simply pleading not guilty? The answer lay in the law of property. If a person pleaded not guilty but was convicted of a felony, their property and lands would be forfeit, seized by the crown. Their family, their children, would be left with nothing. However, if they died under the torment of peine forte et dure without entering a plea, they had technically not been convicted of a crime. Their property could then pass to their heirs. It was a final, desperate act of sacrifice for one's family. One of the most powerful stories of this ordeal is that of Margaret Clitheroe, a woman from York in the 16th century. She was a devout Catholic at a time when Catholicism was outlawed in England. She was accused of the crime of harboring fugitive priests in her home. When brought to trial, she refused to enter a plea. She did this not for property, but to prevent a trial that would force her own children to testify against her and the priests she had helped. For her silence, she was sentenced to the press. They laid her on the ground, a sharp rock placed under her back to maximize the pain. The door was placed upon her, and the weights were piled on. It was said that the weight was so great that her ribs were crushed and forced out of her back. She died within 15 minutes. Her last act, an agonizing, silent defiance to protect those she loved. Margaret Clitheroe was later canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church, a testament to her faith and her courage. Pressing was a uniquely terrible fate, a punishment for silence where the victim's only choices were to condemn themselves through a plea or to be slowly, brutally crushed to death. This method of execution is known as the breaking wheel, or simply the wheel. It was a punishment reserved for the most despised criminals, notorious bandits, murderers, and traitors whose crimes were deemed so severe that a simple death was not enough. Their end had to be a spectacle of utter annihilation. The apparatus itself was often just a large wooden cartwheel, the kind you would see on any wagon, repurposed for this grim task. The condemned person would be taken to a public scaffold and tied spread-eagled to this wheel, their arms and legs stretched out and bound to the spokes. They were utterly exposed, a human canvas awaiting the artist of their destruction. That artist was the executioner, and his tool was not an axe or a sword, but a heavy iron bar or hammer. His work began with a cold, methodical precision. Starting at the limbs, he would raise the iron bar high and bring it down with crushing force onto the victim's shins. The sound of bone splintering, a sickening, wet crunch would echo across the silent square. He would then move to the thighs, then the forearms, and then the upper arms, systematically shattering every major bone in each limb. The goal was diabolical: to pulverize the limbs while keeping the victim's torso, their vital organs, intact. This was crucial, as it prolonged the agony for as long as possible. The victim would remain conscious, screaming and writhing as, one by one, their limbs were turned into a pulpy mass of shattered bone and mangled tissue. Sometimes, after the limbs were destroyed, the executioner would deliver a final blow of mercy, a coup de grace, striking the chest or neck to end the suffering. But often, the mercy never came. The final act was the most grotesque. The executioner would take the victim's now boneless, pliable limbs and weave them through the spokes of the wheel, like threading a nightmarish tapestry. The wheel, now bearing its gruesome, shattered burden, was then hoisted to the top of a tall pole, to be displayed for all. The victim, if still alive, would be left to die slowly from shock, blood loss, or dehydration, often over the course of hours or even days. Crows and other scavenging birds would descend to peck at the helpless figure, a final, horrifying indignity. One of the most infamous cases was that of Peter Stump, a German farmer executed in 1589. He was accused of being a serial killer, a cannibal, and a werewolf who had terrorized the villages of Bedburg. Under torture, he confessed to the murder and cannibalization of 14 children, including his own son. His execution was designed to be as monstrous as his alleged crimes. First, flesh was torn from his body with red-hot pincers. Then, he was strapped to the breaking wheel, where his limbs were systematically pulverized. He remained conscious throughout the ordeal, his wails of agony echoing until the executioner finally granted him the mercy of beheading. His mangled corpse was then burned at the stake, ensuring not even ashes remained for a proper burial. The breaking wheel was the epitome of punitive theater. It didn't just kill a person, it deconstructed them, turning them from a human being into a broken object, a terrifying warning that spun slowly in the wind, reminding all who passed by of the savage price of wickedness. The ingenuity of medieval cruelty knew few bounds. While the breaking wheel destroyed the body through brutal force, our next punishment achieved a similar end through overwhelming heat and liquid. It was a fate reserved for criminals whose actions were seen as a deep betrayal of trust, particularly poisoners and coin forgers. This was the horrifying spectacle of being boiled alive. Imagine a large public square, a great cauldron or kettle set over a roaring fire. The contents of the cauldron bubble and churn, sending thick, foul-smelling steam into the air. The liquid might be water, oil, tar, or in some cases, even molten lead. The condemned person would be brought to a platform next to this terrible vessel, stripped of their clothes, and prepared for their ordeal. The psychological terror of this punishment was as significant as the physical pain. The victim would be forced to watch the liquid boiling, to feel its heat on their skin, to hear the ominous bubbling that foretold their own agonizing end. The execution itself could be carried out in two ways. Sometimes, the victim was plunged directly into the scalding soup, a swift but shocking immersion into unimaginable pain. More often, though, the process was deliberately slow. The prisoner would be suspended by ropes or chains and lowered, inch by tortuous inch, into the cauldron. The moment their feet touched the liquid, the searing agony would begin. The skin would redden instantly, then blister and begin to slough away in pale strips. The victim's screams would be almost unbearable to witness. Yet the crowds would watch in morbid fascination. As they were lowered deeper, the boiling liquid would work its way into the body, cooking the muscles and internal organs. Death was not instantaneous. It was a slow process of being cooked from the outside in. It could take up to 2 hours for the victim to finally succumb to the excruciating pain, shock, and fatal rupturing of their organs. In 16th century England, this punishment was officially sanctioned by King Henry VIII, particularly for poisoners. One of the most infamous cases was that of Richard Roos, a cook in the household of the Bishop of Rochester. In 1531, Roos was accused of high treason for attempting to poison the bishop and his guests by stirring a toxic powder into a pot of porridge. Though the bishop survived, 2 other people died, and many more fell violently ill. As an example to all other poisoners, Roos was sentenced to be boiled to death at Smithfield. Chronicles of the time describe how he was suspended over the cauldron and repeatedly dunked into the scalding water. His agonized wails filled the square as the flesh was literally boiled from his bones. It was a gruesome, visceral warning against the reviled crime of poisoning. A punishment that ensured the criminal's end was as torturous as the one they had inflicted on their own victims. There is a particular horror reserved for death by fire. It is a primal fear, one that transcends cultures and centuries. And, in the medieval world, this fear was harnessed as one of the ultimate punishments, a method reserved for crimes considered so profound that they threatened the very foundations of society and God's law on earth. This was the fate of being burned at the stake. This was not a punishment for common thieves or murderers. It was the designated penalty for the most heinous offenses in the eyes of the church heresy and witchcraft. The logic, in its own terrifying way, was symbolic. Fire was seen as an element of purification. By consigning a heretic or a witch to the flames, the authorities believed they were not just executing a criminal, but cleansing the community of their corrupting influence. The fire would destroy the body so completely that no physical remnant, no relic, could be left behind for their followers to venerate. It was a sentence of total annihilation. The scene of a burning was a powerful and solemn public event. A large pyre of wood, often interspersed with straw and other flammable materials, would be constructed around a central, heavy post. The condemned would be led to the stake, sometimes forced to wear a cap painted with demons or symbols of their crime. They would be chained or tied securely to the post, and the wood would be piled high around them, sometimes up to their neck. Then, a torch would be brought forward. The moment the flames caught, the dry wood would ignite with a roar, and a wall of heat and smoke would surround the victim. The pain would be immediate and all-consuming. The fire would lick at their skin, charring it black, while the superheated air would scorch their lungs with every frantic breath. It was a death of unimaginable agony, a sensory overload of burning flesh, blinding smoke, and the roar of the inferno. Perhaps no story illustrates this horror more vividly than that of Joan of Arc. The young French peasant girl who led an army, who claimed to hear the voice of God, was ultimately captured by her enemies and put on trial for heresy. In 1431, in the marketplace of Rouen, the 19-year-old Joan was led to her execution. She was tied to a tall pillar, high above the pyre, so the entire crowd could see her. As the flames rose around her, she reportedly asked for a crucifix to be held up before her, her eyes fixed on it as the smoke and fire engulfed her. The executioner, it is said, grew afraid that she would not die quickly from the smoke, and so made the fire burn hotter and faster to end her suffering. Even in her final moments, she cried out the name of Jesus, her voice rising above the crackling of the flames until she finally fell silent after the fire had died down. Her body, or what was left of it, was not immediately disposed of. The coals were raked back to expose her charred corpse to the crowd, to prove that she was indeed dead and not some supernatural being who had escaped the flames. Then the fire was lit again, burning her remains until they were nothing but fine ash. Those ashes were then gathered and thrown into the River Seine, a final, definitive act to ensure that her physical presence was erased from the world forever. Burning at the stake was more than just an execution. It was a theological statement, written in fire and ash. It was a terrifying demonstration of the absolute power of the church and state, and a grim, public lesson on the ultimate price of defiance, the gallows. The very word conjures a stark and grim image, a wooden frame standing dark against the sky, a silent silhouette on a lonely hill or in a crowded town square. For the vast majority of people sentenced to death in medieval Europe, the thieves, the poachers, the peasant rebels, the outcasts, this was their final destination, while beheading was a privilege reserved for the nobility. Hanging was the people's death public, shameful, and brutally efficient. But the hangings of this era were often not the swift, neck-breaking drops we might imagine. The common method was the short drop, where the victim was pushed from a ladder or a cart, or dropped through a trapdoor only a few feet. This fall was not long enough to generate the force needed to snap the neck. Instead, it resulted in a slow, agonizing death by strangulation. Imagine the scene, so common in medieval life. A small crowd had gathered to witness the end of a man like Jack Cornwall, a humble peasant farmer turned highwayman out of sheer desperation. He is led stumbling into the morning chill, the faces in the crowd a mixture of pity, contempt, and morbid anticipation. He barely feels the rough hemp of the noose as it settles around his neck. The executioner, a hooded figure, mutters a half-hearted prayer. Then, with a sudden jerk of a lever, the floor gives way. He does not die instantly. Instead, he dangles, the rope constricting around his throat, cutting off his breath. His body, driven by the primal instinct to survive, begins a grotesque dance of death. His legs kick and twitch spasmodically at the empty air. The crowd would watch as his face turned mottled shades of purple and black, his eyes bulging hideously, and his tongue protruding from his mouth. It was a horrible, drawn-out ordeal, taking many agonizing minutes for life to finally cease. This was not a clean or dignified end. It was a raw display of the state's power over the life and breath of its subjects. And the punishment did not always end with the final twitch. Often, the body of the hanged criminal was left to twist in the wind for days or even weeks, a grim reminder to any who might follow in his footsteps. It became a forlorn human scarecrow, pecked at by crows, a decomposing warning against straying from the path of law and custom. The gallows were a constant, grim fixture in the medieval landscape. It was where the stories of countless ordinary people ended, not with a blaze of glory or martyrdom, but with the quiet, choking finality of the rope, a stark and brutal symbol of a merciless world. In the rigid hierarchy of the medieval world, even the manner of your death was dictated by your station in life. While the common thief met his end on the gallows, the nobleman or royal convicted of a capital crime was often granted a death deemed more honorable, beheading. In theory, it was a gesture of mercy. A single, swift stroke of a sharp axe or sword was meant to be quick, clinical, and far less agonizing than the slow strangulation of the rope. It was a clean death for a person of rank. But the grim reality didn't always align with that ideal. The executioner was not always a master of his craft, and the tools were not always perfect. An axe could be dull, the swordsman's aim could be unsteady, and the victim, in their final moments, might flinch. In these instances, the merciful act of beheading could transform into a prolonged and horrific butchery. Perhaps no story illustrates this more tragically than the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, in 1587. Condemned to death for plotting against her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I, Mary faced her fate with a regal composure that awed those who witnessed it. On the fateful morning, she mounted the scaffold, draped in black, clutching a prayer book. After a final prayer, she calmly knelt and placed her head on the block. What should have been a single, swift end descended into a grisly spectacle. The executioner raised his axe, but his first blow missed Mary's neck entirely, striking the back of her head with a dull thud that shattered her skull. A shocked groan rippled through the crowd. Incredibly, Mary remained conscious, her body twitching as she let out a low moan of agony. The horrified executioner readied himself for a second blow. This time the axe found its mark, but only partially, becoming lodged in the queen's neck and failing to sever her head completely. It took a third, desperate hacking blow to finally cut through the last remaining sinew and gristle, ending her life in a spray of crimson. But the horror was not yet over. When the executioner lifted the severed head by the hair to show the crowd, he was left grasping only Mary's wig. Her head, with its short, gray hair, tumbled to the ground and rolled, coming to rest face up. Witnesses would later report, with a shudder, that her lips were still moving in silent prayer for several seconds after she was dead. It was a gruesome, botched, and excruciating end for a queen. A horrifying reminder that in the medieval era, even a death of privilege offered no guarantee of mercy. The name itself is a litany of horror to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. It was a punishment that was not a single act of death, but a prolonged, theatrical, and systematic unmaking of a human being. It was designed to inflict the maximum amount of suffering and public shame, and to serve as the most terrifying warning the state could conceive. The appalling process was a ritual in 4 acts. It began with the drawing. The condemned traitor would be tied to a wooden hurdle or frame, and then dragged by a horse through the rough, cobbled streets to the place of execution. This was the first humiliation, a painful journey that would leave them bruised, bloodied, and covered in filth before the true ordeal even began. The second act was the hanging. Once at the gallows, a noose would be placed around their neck, and they would be hanged, but only until they were on the brink of death. They would be cut down while still alive, revived just enough to be conscious for the horrors that were to follow. Then came the third, and most unspeakable act, which was also sometimes referred to as the drawing, in the sense of drawing out the innards. The half-strangled, still living victim was stripped naked and laid out before the bloodthirsty crowd. The executioner would take a sharp blade, slit open their abdomen, and begin to pull out their entrails, their intestines, their organs, and toss them into a fire that had been prepared nearby. The victim, in their final moments of agony, was forced to witness their own disembowelment. Finally, after the life had mercifully fled, came the quartering. The executioner would take up a heavy axe and hack the now lifeless body into 4 pieces. The head was severed, often to be dipped in tar for preservation and mounted on a spike above London Bridge or another prominent city gate. The 4 quarters of the body were then sent to the far corners of the kingdom, to be displayed publicly as a final, hideous warning against insurrection. Few who suffered this fate are as famous as William Wallace, the Scottish knight who led a rebellion against English rule in the late 13th century. After being captured and convicted of treason in 1305, Wallace was sentenced to this ultimate punishment. He was dragged through the streets of London, hanged until nearly dead, and then disemboweled and emasculated while still alive. Defiant to the end, he endured the unimaginable torment before he was finally beheaded and his body quartered. His preserved head was impaled on a spike on London Bridge, and his limbs were sent to 4 different cities in Scotland and England as a stark message from the English king. It was a horrific end, a punishment designed not only to kill a traitor, but to destroy them utterly, body and legacy, through humiliation, mutilation, and dispersal. It stands in history as the pinnacle of medieval state-sanctioned brutality. For most, death was the end of punishment. But for some pirates, notorious highwaymen, and rebels, the authorities sought to make an example that would last long after their final breath. The sentence was not just to die, but to decay in public, to become a permanent monument of rotting flesh and bone. This post-mortem torment was achieved through gibbeting. A gibbet was an iron cage, custom forged by a blacksmith to roughly the shape of the human form. After the criminal was executed, usually by hanging, their body would be taken down and coated in tar. This was a practical measure, meant to preserve the body for as long as possible, to slow the inevitable process of decomposition and prolong the spectacle. The tarred corpse was then fitted into the iron cage, which was locked shut and hoisted by a chain to the top of a tall post. This gibbet was not erected in an execution yard. It was placed at a crossroads, at the entrance to a town, or near the scene of the criminal's most infamous deeds. ensuring maximum visibility. And there it would hang for months, sometimes for years. Imagine the horror of encountering this on a lonely road. The body, black and rigid, swaying and creaking in the wind, a grotesque human wind chime. At first, it would still resemble a person, a grim and silent sentinel. But over time, nature would perform its own slow-motion execution. Scavenging birds, crows, and ravens would come to perch on the cage, pecking at the rotting features through the iron bars. They would pluck out the eyes, tear strips of flesh from the cheeks, and expose the bone beneath. The stench of decay would be overwhelming, a foul cloud that hung over the area, a constant, nauseating reminder of the fate that awaited the lawless. Local legend often grew around these gibbets. They became haunted places, spots where the ghost of the criminal was said to linger, their agonized spirit trapped within the iron cage, unable to find rest. Travelers would hurry past, averting their eyes, whispering prayers. The gibbet cage was a punishment for the living as much as it was an indignity for the dead. It was a tool of psychological warfare. For the family of the condemned, it was a source of unending shame and grief, unable to give their loved one a proper burial, forced to know their body was becoming a public horror show. For the community, it was a constant, inescapable lesson in obedience. To see a man slowly reduced to a skeleton in a cage was to understand the long and unforgiving memory of the king's justice. The body would eventually waste away, leaving only a jumble of bones rattling within the iron frame, a forlorn skeleton dancing in the wind, until even that turned to dust and was forgotten. Just as the scold's bridle was a punishment conceived almost exclusively for women, so too was our next device. It combined public humiliation with the terror of drowning, and was reserved for women who committed the social crime of being disruptive, argumentative, or unfaithful. This was the dunking stool. The apparatus was a simple chair, fixed to the end of a long wooden lever. This entire contraption was set up on the bank of a river, a pond, or even a large trough of water in the village square. The accused woman, often referred to as a common scold, would be strapped firmly into the chair. With the crowd gathered to watch, the punishment would begin. The operators would work the lever, plunging the chair and its helpless occupant backwards into the cold, murky water. The shock of the icy immersion would be instant, a gasp for air stolen away as she was submerged. She would be held under for several seconds, long enough for panic to set in, for her lungs to burn, for the terror of drowning to become terrifyingly real. Then, just as she felt she could hold her breath no longer, she would be hoisted back up into the air, sputtering, coughing, and gasping for breath, water streaming from her hair and clothes. The crowd would jeer and laugh at her pathetic, sodden state, but this was only a brief respite. Before she could fully recover, the lever would be worked again, and she would be plunged back under the water. This cycle of immersion and recovery could be repeated dozens of times. It was a cruel game, playing on the most primal fear of suffocation. The duration and frequency of the dunks were often left to the whim of the crowd or the magistrate overseeing the punishment. If the crowd was particularly hostile, they might call for her to be held under for longer, pushing her ever closer to the brink of actually drowning. The dunking stool was a punishment that walked a fine line between humiliation and lethal force. While not always intended to kill, accidents were common. A woman with a weak heart could suffer a fatal shock from the repeated cold immersions, or she could inhale water and drown. More than the physical danger, however, it was a ritual of social control. It was a way for the community, led by its male authorities, to physically enforce conformity on women who were deemed too loud, too troublesome, or too independent. It was a brutal and visceral reminder that a woman's place was to be quiet and obedient. To be dunked was to be publicly washed of your defiance, to have your spirit broken by water and shame, until all that was left was a shivering, terrified, and silenced woman. We now return to the confines of the dungeon, to a device that perfected the art of slow, agonizing pain through the simple principles of gravity and pressure. It required no complex mechanics, only a sharp point and the victim's own body weight. It was known as the Judas cradle, or the Judas chair. The device itself was a tall, pyramid-shaped seat, carved from wood or capped with iron, its tip honed to a cruel point. This pyramid was mounted on a sturdy, three-legged stool. Above it, a system of ropes and pulleys was attached to the ceiling. The victim would be stripped naked, their hands and feet often bound, and a harness would be placed around their waist or under their arms. They would then be slowly, deliberately hoisted into the air by the ropes and positioned directly over the pyramid's sharp point. The true torture began with the descent. The torturer would carefully release the rope, lowering the victim, inch by agonizing inch, onto the tip of the cradle. The point was aimed to press into the victim's most sensitive areas, the groin, the anus, or the coccyx. The pain would be immediate and excruciating, a sharp, piercing agony that radiated through the entire body. The victim's full weight was concentrated on that single, small point, designed to stretch, tear, and impale. The interrogator could control the intensity of the pain with masterful precision. They could leave the victim suspended just above the point, the fear of the coming pain almost as agonizing as the pain itself. They could lower them onto it for brief periods, then raise them again, creating a horrifying cycle of relief and renewed torment. This process could be drawn out for hours or even days. The goal was to break the victim's will through a combination of agonizing pain, sleep deprivation, and utter helplessness. To increase the suffering, weights were sometimes attached to the victim's legs, adding more downward pressure and forcing the point deeper into their flesh. The Judas cradle was a device of pure sadism. It was rarely cleaned between uses, meaning the risk of severe infection from any open wounds was incredibly high. It was a punishment that violated the body in the most intimate and brutal way possible. It was not designed to kill quickly, but to keep the victim in a state of sustained, unbearable agony until their mind and body finally surrendered. A confession obtained on the Judas cradle was not an admission of guilt. It was a desperate plea for an end to a torment so profound it bordered on the unimaginable. There is a unique and profound horror in the idea of having your own skin removed. Our skin is our boundary with the world, the very thing that holds us together. To have it stripped away is to be unmade, to be reduced to raw, exposed flesh. In the medieval world, this ultimate violation was a very real, albeit rare, form of punishment. It is known as flaying. This was a sentence reserved for the most extreme crimes, sacrilege, high treason, or the murder of a high-ranking official. It was a slow, meticulous, and agonizing process that required a skilled hand and a strong stomach on the part of the executioner. The victim would be tied to a table or a post, their body completely immobilized. The executioner, armed with a set of small, razor-sharp knives, would begin his work. He would start with the face or the limbs, making careful incisions around the features. Then, working slowly, he would begin to peel the skin away from the muscle and tissue underneath. The pain is beyond description. Every nerve ending would be exposed to the air, screaming in agony. The victim would be fully conscious for much of the process, watching their own skin being removed in long, bloody strips. The goal was often to remove the skin in a single, continuous piece, a testament to the executioner's grim skill. In some historical accounts, after the skin was removed, it was nailed to a public place, like a church door or a town gate, as a terrifying and permanent warning. The skin of a corrupt judge, for example, might be used to upholster the chair his successor would sit upon, a constant reminder of the price of injustice. Survival of the flaying itself was nearly impossible. The massive blood loss, the shock, and the overwhelming pain would usually lead to death long before the process was complete. If, by some miracle, a person did survive the initial ordeal, they would almost certainly die from infection shortly after, their raw, skinless body having no defense against the bacteria of the world. Flaying was more than just an execution. It was an act of ultimate desecration. It stripped a person of their very identity, their human form. It was a punishment that sought to erase them not just from life, but from the recognizable shape of humanity itself. It stands as one of the most brutal and terrifying testaments to the depths of cruelty the human mind can conceive. A punishment so horrific that it feels more like something from a nightmare than from the pages of history. The punishments we have discussed so far, however brutal, often involved complex devices or lengthy rituals. Our next method was horrifying in its simplicity, requiring little more than a common tool and a complete absence of mercy. This was the saw torture. It was a method of execution where the victim was literally sawn in half. While some accounts depict this being done horizontally, the most common and terrifying form was vertical. The condemned would be hung upside down, their legs bound and forced apart, straddling a wooden frame. Hanging upside down served a grimly practical purpose. The blood would rush to the head, ensuring the victim remained conscious for as long as possible throughout the agonizing process. Two executioners would then take up a large two-man saw, the kind used for felling trees. They would place the teeth of the saw at the victim's groin and begin their work. The saw would bite into the flesh, and with a rhythmic, back-and-forth motion, they would begin to slice downwards, through the abdomen, the chest, and finally, the head. The process was not quick. The blade would catch on bone, tear through muscle, and sever organs one by one. The victim, hanging inverted, would be forced to watch the saw as it slowly, inexorably advanced through their own body. Their screams would echo in the chamber, growing weaker as their body was destroyed from within. This was a punishment that appeared in different cultures, often reserved for crimes seen as particularly subversive. In some parts of Europe, it was used on those accused of witchcraft or sodomy. In other regions, it was a penalty for rebellion or high treason. The symbolism of being split in two was powerful, a literal representation of a person who had divided themselves from God or their king. The saw torture was a descent into pure mechanical butchery. It reduced a human being to little more than a piece of timber to be cut. There was no room for confession, no chance for last words. There was only the grinding sound of steel on bone, the sight of one's own body being unmade from the inside out, and the slow, horrifying realization that your end would come only when the saw completed its journey. It represents a terrifying fusion of the mundane and the monstrous, where a simple workman's tool was transformed into an instrument of unimaginable, drawn-out horror. Not all instruments of torture were large and theatrical. Some of the most terrifying were small, intimate, and designed to attack the body from within. Such was the case with the device known by the chillingly poetic name, the Pear of Anguish. This was a small, pear-shaped instrument, forged from iron or steel. It was comprised of several spoon-like segments or petals that were held together at the top. At the other end was a key or a crank. When the key was turned, the petals of the pear would slowly and mechanically spread apart, expanding outwards with incredible force. The purpose of this device was to be inserted into one of the body's orifices, the mouth, the anus, or the vagina. Once inside, the torturer would begin to turn the key. The metal segments would expand, stretching the surrounding flesh from the inside, causing immense internal pressure and agonizing pain. If the crank was turned far enough, the device could exert enough force to tear tissue, break bones like the jaw, and cause catastrophic, irreversible internal damage. The Pear of Anguish was a specialized tool of torment and humiliation, with its use often tailored to the nature of the accused's crime. For those accused of heresy or blasphemy crimes of speech, the pear would be forced into their mouth. For women accused of inducing an abortion or adultery, it would be used vaginally. And for men accused of homosexuality, it was inserted anally. The device was rarely, if ever, a direct cause of death. Its primary function was to inflict excruciating pain and profound psychological humiliation. It was a violation of the most personal and private aspects of a person's body. The slow, controlled expansion created a sense of impending rupture, a terrifying feeling of being torn apart from within. It was an instrument that didn't just cause pain, it dehumanized, turning the body's own cavities into a stage for horrific torment. The shame and trauma inflicted by the Pear of Anguish would last a lifetime, a scarring memory of a pain that was as intimate as it was unspeakable. There is one device that has captured the modern imagination more than any other, a symbol of medieval cruelty so iconic it appears in countless horror films and stories. This is the Iron Maiden. Picture a tall, upright coffin or sarcophagus, forged from iron and built in the shape of a human figure, often with a serene, female face modeled on its front, hence the maiden. The front of the device was hinged, allowing it to swing open like a set of double doors, but the inside was anything but serene. The interior was lined with dozens of long, sharp iron spikes. The victim would be placed inside this cabinet, and the doors would be slowly closed. The spikes were strategically positioned so that, as the doors shut, they would pierce the victim's body from all sides. They were carefully measured to be long enough to penetrate flesh, but short enough to avoid puncturing vital organs immediately. This was the diabolical genius of the Iron Maiden's design. It was meant to prolong death. The victim would stand impaled, unable to move, bleeding from dozens of wounds. They would die a slow, agonizing death from blood loss and pain over the course of many hours or even days. Their muffled screams trapped within the iron sarcophagus. It is a truly terrifying image. However, there is a fascinating twist to the story of the Iron Maiden. Despite its powerful reputation as a pinnacle of medieval torture, most modern historians agree that it was likely never used as a genuine execution device during the Middle Ages. There are no credible historical records from the period that describe its use. The Iron Maiden as we know it seems to be a creation of a later era, likely the 18th or 19th century, a time when there was a morbid fascination with the Dark Ages. It was a fiction, a sensationalist invention created for museums and exhibitions, pieced together from descriptions of other devices and a healthy dose of grim imagination. It was a perfect symbol of what people thought the Middle Ages were like: brutal, sadistic, and inventive in their cruelty. So, while the Iron Maiden may not be a true artifact of medieval torture, its story is revealing in another way. It shows our enduring fascination with the horrors of the past, and our need to create symbols that encapsulate that darkness. The Iron Maiden may be a historical fiction, but the terror it represents, the fear of being trapped, impaled, and left to die in darkness, was a very real part of the medieval world, even if it took different, but no less horrific, forms. In a world deeply steeped in faith, justice was not always decided by a judge or a jury. Sometimes, when a person's guilt or innocence was impossible to determine, the case was put directly into the hands of God. This was trial by ordeal, a process where the accused was subjected to a dangerous and painful test. It was believed that God would intervene, protecting the innocent and allowing the guilty to be harmed. One of the most common of these tests was the ordeal by fire. There were several forms this ordeal could take. In one common method, the accused was required to carry a piece of red-hot iron in their bare hands for a set distance, usually 9 feet. After they dropped the iron, their hand would be immediately bound and sealed with a cloth. 3 days later, the binding would be removed in the presence of a priest. This was the moment of judgment. If the wound was healing cleanly, without festering or infection, it was taken as a sign from God that the person was innocent. The divine had protected them from the fire's full effect. However, if the wound was blistered, infected, and festering, it was seen as proof of their guilt. God had abandoned them to the flames. Another form of the ordeal involved walking barefoot over a path of red-hot plowshares, sharp iron plates that had been heated in a fire. As with the hot iron, the state of the person's feet after a few days would determine their fate. It is difficult for us to imagine a system of justice based on such a premise. From a modern, scientific perspective, the outcome seems almost certain. Anyone holding red-hot iron or walking on hot plates would be severely burned. And indeed, many were. The ordeal was heavily weighted against the accused. However, there may have been ways to influence the outcome. A priest could potentially cool the iron slightly before it was handed over, or the binding on the hand could be treated with salves to promote clean healing. The interpretation of the wound after 3 days was also subjective. A sympathetic priest might declare a festering wound to be healing well, while a hostile one could condemn a minor burn as a sign of God's wrath. Trial by ordeal was a system born of faith and desperation. It was a way to find certainty in an uncertain world, but it was a form of justice where one's fate depended not on evidence or testimony, but on chance, superstition, and the inscrutable will of a silent God. To face the ordeal by fire was to place your life not in the hands of men, but into the heart of the flame itself, and pray for a miracle. Just as fire could be used to determine guilt, so could its opposite element, water. Trial by ordeal by water was another method of leaving judgment to the divine, but its logic was often cruelly inverted, particularly when used against those accused of witchcraft. There were two primary forms of this ordeal. The first involved cold water. The accused, often a woman suspected of witchcraft, would have her hands and feet bound together. A rope would be tied around her waist, and she would be thrown into a river or a deep pond. This is where the terrible paradox of the ordeal came into play. It was widely believed that water, being a pure element used in baptism, would reject anything evil. Therefore, if the woman floated, it was seen as a sign that the pure water was refusing her. She was guilty. The crowd on the riverbank would cheer as she was pulled from the water, only to be taken away for execution, usually by burning. If, however, she sank, it was taken as a sign that the pure water had accepted her. She was innocent, but this declaration of innocence was often a posthumous one. If the person holding the rope was not quick enough to pull her out, she would drown. It was a horrific catch-22. To survive the ordeal was to be proven guilty and condemned to death. To be proven innocent often meant dying in the process. The second form of the ordeal used hot water. The accused would be forced to plunge their bare arm into a cauldron of boiling water, often to retrieve a stone or a ring from the bottom. As with the ordeal by fire, their arm would then be bound and sealed. After 3 days, the wound would be inspected. A clean, healing burn was a sign of innocence. A blistered, infected one was proof of guilt. Like the ordeal by fire, this process was rife with potential for manipulation. The temperature of the water could be adjusted, and the final judgment of the wound was entirely subjective. But for the person facing the ordeal, it was a terrifying proposition. They were putting their faith and their flesh into the hands of a system that equated survival with damnation. Trial by water was a reflection of a world so desperate for signs, so convinced of the presence of evil, that it would create tests where the only true escape was often death itself. It was a grim and twisted form of justice, where innocence was a verdict only the dead could truly receive. Not all punishments were a public spectacle. Some of the cruelest fates unfolded far from the light of day, in the cold, damp bowels of the castle. We have spoken of the dungeon as a setting for interrogation, but for many, the dungeon itself was the sentence. It was a punishment not of fleeting pain, but of endless, grinding misery and the slow-motion horror of being erased from the world. The typical medieval dungeon was more than just a cell. It was a sensory deprivation chamber designed to break the human spirit. Imagine being dragged down a narrow, winding staircase, the air growing colder and staler with every step. The heavy oak door, banded with iron, slams shut behind you, and you are plunged into an almost absolute darkness. Your world shrinks to the confines of a small stone room, its walls slick with moisture and mold, its floor a mix of rotting straw and unseen filth. The silence is the first thing that attacks you. It is a heavy, oppressive silence, broken only by the drip of water from the ceiling, the distant scuttling of rats, or the faint, muffled moans of other forgotten souls in nearby cells. Days and nights blur into an indistinguishable gray twilight, marked only by the meager portion of moldy bread and foul water shoved through a slot in the door. There is no human contact, save for the sneering face of a jailer who sees you not as a person, but as a thing to be warehoused until you rot. But there was a place within the dungeon reserved for an even more terrible fate. It was a special kind of cell known as an oubliette, from the French word oublier, meaning to forget. The oubliette was often a bottle-shaped cell, narrow at the top and wider at the bottom, accessible only through a small trapdoor in the ceiling. The prisoner was lowered down by a rope and then simply left there. The trapdoor was closed, and they were abandoned to the darkness. There was no way out. The walls were often too high to climb, and there were no other doors or windows. The prisoner in the oubliette was truly and utterly alone, entombed alive in a stone womb deep within the earth. They were left with nothing but their own thoughts, their growing hunger, and the chilling realization that no one was coming for them. The world above had forgotten them. Their sentence was to slowly starve to death in pitch-black solitude. The psychological torment of the oubliette is difficult to fathom. The complete absence of light and sound would lead to hallucinations. The mind, desperate for stimulation, would begin to create its own phantoms. The gnawing hunger and thirst would become a constant, maddening obsession. And through it all was the crushing weight of absolute hopelessness. Many prisoners left their marks on the walls in their final days, desperate scratchings of a name, a prayer, or a crude drawing, a final, poignant attempt to prove they had existed. These faint carvings, still visible in some castles today, are ghostly whisperings from an abyss of suffering, a testament to the fact that sometimes the cruelest punishment is not what is done to a person, but what is not done for them. To be thrown in the oubliette was to be condemned to become a ghost before you were even dead. For those who escaped the finality of the oubliette or the gallows, justice often exacted its price in flesh. Mutilation was a common and brutally effective form of punishment throughout the Middle Ages. It was a sentence that the criminal was forced to carry with them for the rest of their lives, a permanent physical advertisement of their transgression. It was not intended to kill, but to mark, to disable, and to serve as a constant, living warning to others. The logic was simple and symbolic. The punishment should fit the crime by targeting the part of the body that had committed it. A thief, for instance, might have their hand chopped off. It was believed that the hand that stole should be taken away. Repeat offenders were especially vulnerable to this fate. Imagine a man caught stealing for a second or third time, his arm held fast against a wooden block. The executioner would raise a heavy cleaver or axe and, with a single, swift blow, sever the hand at the wrist. The wound was often cauterized with a hot iron to stop the bleeding, adding another layer of searing pain to the ordeal. From that day forward, the man was not only shamed, but also permanently disabled. In an age of manual labor, the loss of a hand could be an economic death sentence, making it nearly impossible to find honest work, and often forcing the person back into a life of begging or crime, now with even greater desperation. Every time he tried to eat, to dress, to perform the simplest task, He would be reminded of his crime. The empty sleeve or the scarred stump was a brand far more potent than one made of ink or fire. Similarly, other crimes were punished with a grimly appropriate mutilation. A person convicted of perjury or blasphemy crimes of speech might have their tongue cut out. An official would use a pair of iron forceps to pull the tongue from the mouth, and a sharp knife would do the rest. The victim was silenced forever, unable to spread more lies or speak ill of God and the church. A spy, whose crime was seeing what they should not have seen, might be blinded, their eyes gouged out with a heated poker. A poacher, who illegally hunted on the Lord's land, might have his ears cropped or his nose split, marking him as a trespasser. These acts were almost always performed in public, adding humiliation to the agony. The crowd would watch as the executioner performed his gruesome surgery, the criminal's screams serving as a visceral deterrent. Mutilation was a powerful tool for social control. It created a visible underclass of the punished, their bodies serving as a living map of the kingdom's laws. You didn't need to read a law book to know the penalty for theft. You simply had to look at the one-handed beggar in the market square. It was a brutal, unforgettable lesson, carved not in stone, but in the very flesh of those who dared to transgress. Not all punishments involve the shedding of blood or the breaking of bones. Some of the most profound sentences were psychological, designed to humble the powerful and restore a moral balance through the ritual of public shame. This was the act of public penance, a punishment that was especially potent in a world where honor, reputation, and one's standing before God were paramount. This was a sentence often reserved for the mighty, for kings, queens, and powerful nobles whose crimes were too great to be ignored, but whose status made a common execution unthinkable. The goal was to force them to display their contrition publicly, to strip away their symbols of power, and show that even they were subservient to the authority of God and the church. The form of the penance could vary, but it often involved a walk of shame. The penitent would be stripped of their fine robes and jewels and forced to wear a simple, coarse hair shirt, a garment woven from rough animal hair that would chafe and irritate the skin with every movement. Barefoot, they would have to walk a proscribed route through a city, often from a city gate to the steps of a great cathedral. As they walked, they would be subject to the gaze of their own subjects. The same commoners who would normally bow their heads in deference were now free to stare, to murmur, and to witness the humbling of their master. It was a powerful reversal of the social order. The penitent might be required to carry a candle or be lightly flogged by priests along the route, each element adding to the ritual of abasement. Perhaps the most famous historical example of this was the penance of King Henry II of England in 1124. He was widely believed to be responsible for the murder of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket. 4 years after Becket's death, facing political rebellion and seeking divine favor, Henry traveled to Canterbury to atone for his sin. Upon reaching the city, the king removed his royal finery, donned a simple woolen cloak, and walked barefoot through the streets to Becket's tomb in the cathedral. There, before the assembled monks and clergy, he knelt. He confessed his guilt and was then ceremonially flogged by the monks, each one delivering several lashes to the king's bare back. He then spent the entire night in a vigil at the tomb, fasting and praying. For a powerful and proud monarch like Henry, this act of profound public humiliation was a punishment far more significant than a fine or a political sanction. It was a demonstration that even the King of England was not above the judgment of God. Public penance was a powerful piece of theater. It was a way to resolve high-stakes political and religious conflicts without resorting to war or execution. It allowed a ruler to admit fault, appease the heavens, and restore social harmony, all through the simple, yet deeply potent, act of shame. While many medieval punishments were designed to inflict severe pain, some were more focused on pure, unadulterated humiliation. These were devices meant to make the offender look utterly ridiculous, turning them into an object of public mockery. One of the most curious and inventive of these was the drunkard's cloak. This was not a punishment for hardened criminals, but for the town drunk, the person whose constant inebriation had become a public nuisance. Instead of being locked in the stocks, they were sentenced to wear a special garment, a heavy, bottomless wooden barrel. The barrel was fitted over the person's entire torso. A hole was cut in the top for their head to stick through, and two smaller holes were cut in the sides for their arms. Once encased in this clumsy wooden cloak, the offender was forced to parade through the town. The effect was immediately and powerfully comical. The person would be unable to walk properly, forced to waddle and stumble along, the heavy barrel knocking against their knees. They couldn't bend over, they couldn't sit down properly, and they certainly couldn't run away. They were trapped in a walking prison of shame. The symbolism was direct and easy for everyone to understand. The barrel represented the source of their sin, the ale or wine that had led them astray. By being forced to wear it, they were literally carrying the vessel of their own vice. The punishment turned them into a walking cartoon, a living caricature of their own foolishness. Children would run alongside them, laughing and pointing. Adults would heckle them from their windows and stalls. The town dogs might bark at the strange, shuffling creature. The humiliation was total. The drunkard's cloak was designed to make the wearer feel so profoundly foolish that they would think twice before overindulging again. In some variations, the barrel was made extra heavy to add physical discomfort to the psychological shame. In others, the offender was forced to carry a tankard or a bottle to make the nature of their crime perfectly clear. While it seems almost lighthearted compared to the rack or the breaking wheel, we should not underestimate the power of such shame in a small, close-knit medieval community. Reputation was everything. To be the subject of such widespread public ridicule could be devastating, affecting one's family, their trade, and their social standing for years to come. The drunkard's cloak was a clever and cruel device that punished not with pain, but with laughter, proving that sometimes the most effective torment is simply to be made a fool of. Hanging was the common method of execution by strangulation, but it was a public and often messy affair. In some parts of Europe, particularly in Spain, a different method was perfected, one that was more intimate, more controlled, and in its own way, even more chilling. This device was the garrote. Unlike hanging, which relied on a drop to sever the spinal cord or a long suspension to cause asphyxiation, the garrote killed purely by compression. Its design evolved over time, but the principle remained the same: to constrict the neck with mechanical force until life was extinguished. The early form was brutally simple. The condemned would be seated on a stool, their back pressed against a wooden post. A loop of rope was placed around their neck, and a wooden stick was inserted into the loop at the back of the post. The executioner would then twist the stick, tightening the rope like a tourniquet. The pressure on the windpipe would be immense and direct, cutting off the flow of air. Death would be slow, the victim choking and convulsing as their life was squeezed out of them. Later, the device was refined into a more sinister machine. An iron collar was hinged to the post, which would be locked around the victim's neck. At the back, a large screw with a handle passed through the post. As the executioner turned the handle, the iron collar would tighten, crushing the windpipe. But the most infamous version of the garrote included a terrible innovation, a sharp metal spike, aligned with the spinal cord at the base of the skull. As the collar tightened to an unbearable degree, this spike would be driven forward, severing the spinal cord and causing instant death. In theory, this was a more humane advancement, intended to be quicker than simple strangulation. In practice, however, if the spike was misaligned, it could simply bore into the base of the skull, causing catastrophic brain injury but not immediate death, leading to an end of unimaginable agony. The garrote was a uniquely personal execution. The executioner stood directly behind the victim, his hands on the lever. His presence felt until the very last moment. There was no trapdoor, no long drop, just the slow, deliberate turning of a screw. The victim would be fully aware, feeling the pressure build, the air thinning, the world closing in around them. It was a cold, mechanical, and inescapable death, a final, quiet squeeze into darkness. While it never achieved the widespread infamy of the gallows or the guillotine, the garrote remains one of history's most chillingly efficient instruments of death. There are certain methods of execution that seem to transcend mere punishment, entering a realm of such profound cruelty and horror that they defy understanding. One such method, used as an ultimate expression of terror and domination, was impalement. This was not a quick death. It was a slow, agonizing process designed to make an example of the victim in the most visceral way possible. The instrument was simple: a long, thick wooden stake, sharpened to a point at one end. The victim would be forced onto this sharp point, which was inserted into the body, typically through the rectum or vagina. The stake would then be slowly raised upright, and the victim's own body weight would do the rest. Gravity would pull them downwards, forcing the stake to slowly, inexorably, push its way up through the entire length of their torso. A skilled executioner, it was said, could guide the stake in such a way that it would miss all the vital organs, emerging hours later at the shoulder or the back of the neck. This was done to ensure the victim remained alive for as long as possible, impaled upon the stake, a living, screaming monument to the wrath of their captor. Death, when it finally came, would be the result of massive internal trauma, dehydration, or shock. The process could take hours, or, in some horrifying accounts, days. The victim would be left on display, a grotesque figure silhouetted against the sky, their screams eventually fading to whimpers, and then to silence. While used in various cultures, impalement is most famously associated with one historical figure, Vlad III, the 15th century ruler of Wallachia, better known to history as Vlad the Impaler, the inspiration for the legend of Dracula. Vlad used impalement as his primary tool of psychological warfare. He did not execute his enemies in private. He created entire forests of the impaled. Imagine approaching his castle and seeing not banners, but thousands of stakes, each bearing the writhing or decaying body of a captured soldier. a rebellious noble, or a common thief. The sight, the smell, the sound, it was a vision of hell on earth. It was a message of absolute, uncompromising power. It was intended to break the will of his enemies before a single sword was drawn in battle. For Vlad, impalement was not just an execution. It was a form of political art. He was known to dine among the forests of the dying, seemingly unmoved by the suffering around him. Impalement was the ultimate desecration of the human form, turning a person into a mere object in a landscape of terror. It remains one of the most brutal and nightmarish punishments ever devised, a symbol of a cruelty so profound it seems to belong more to the realm of dark mythology than to human history. We have walked through a gallery of crude, brutal, and agonizing ends. But our tour concludes with a method of execution that, in the medieval mind, was set apart from all others. It was seen not as butchery, but as an art form, a display of profound skill, and the ultimate noble death. This was beheading by sword. While the axe was a common tool for beheading in places like England, on the European continent, particularly in Germanic lands, the sword was the preferred instrument for dispatching persons of high rank. Unlike an axe, which killed through brute, chopping force, a sword was a weapon of precision. The executioner's sword, known as a Richtschwert in German, was a specialized tool. It was a long, heavy, two-handed sword, but with a crucial difference: it had no sharp point. Its tip was rounded or squared off, as it was never intended for thrusting. Its sole purpose was to deliver a single, clean, powerful cut. To be an executioner who wielded a sword was to be a master of a highly respected, if grim, profession. It required immense strength, unerring accuracy, and nerves of steel. The condemned would typically kneel, their neck exposed. They were not usually placed on a block, which could interfere with the sword's path. They simply knelt, often in prayer, awaiting the blow. The executioner would stand, measure the distance, and with a single, fluid motion, swing the heavy blade in a wide, horizontal arc. A perfect strike would sever the head in one clean cut, a feat of swordsmanship that was often met with a respectful murmur from the crowd. It was seen as a display of immense skill, a masterstroke. An executioner's reputation was built on his ability to perform his duty with this kind of flawless, merciful efficiency. To botch the job, to require a second or third swing, was a mark of professional disgrace. This method was steeped in symbolism. The sword was the weapon of the knight, the symbol of the noble class. To die by the sword was to be afforded a warrior's death, an end that acknowledged your status, even in disgrace. It was a world away from the strangling shame of the gallows or the slow agony of the wheel. It was a final, fleeting moment of dignity in a world that rarely offered it. Of course, for the person kneeling, the distinction between a sword and an axe was likely a small comfort. But in the highly stratified world of medieval Europe, these distinctions were everything. The executioner's sword represents the strange paradox of the age, a society capable of the most grotesque and inventive cruelty, yet also obsessed with honor, ritual, and the idea of a good death. It was the final, and perhaps most civilized act in a profoundly uncivilized theater of justice. As we look back on these stomach-churning creations, a question naturally arises: Why was the justice of this era so deeply entangled with the art of cruelty? The answer is that these punishments were never just about one person. They were a form of dark theater, a morality play written in blood and agony to keep a seething underclass in check. In a world with little means of mass communication, a person's broken body displayed on a wheel or hanging from a gallows was the most powerful message the state could send. It was a performance of power, designed to be unforgettable, to be whispered about in taverns and told as a cautionary tale to frighten children. The suffering was the point. The spectacle was the sermon. And yet, amidst all this calculated brutality, we find stories of incredible, almost unbelievable, human spirit. Think of a woman like Margaret Clitheroe, choosing to be slowly crushed to death rather than subject her children to a trial. Think of Joan of Arc, staring at a simple wooden crucifix as the flames rose around her, her faith unshaken in the face of annihilation. These were not people who were merely broken by the machinery of pain. They endured it, and in their endurance, they found a final, profound act of defiance. It forces us to wonder about the limits of the human will, about that unquenchable spark that allows a person to face unimaginable horror, not with acceptance, but with a quiet, unyielding resolve. Their stories are a testament to the fact that even when the body is destroyed, the spirit can remain unconquered. But this age of public, theatrical cruelty could not last forever. As the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, attitudes began to slowly shift. Thinkers began to question the nature of justice, to argue for reason, and to champion the idea of human dignity. The purpose of punishment began a slow pivot from pure retribution to something resembling reform. The spectacle of public execution came to be seen not as a sign of strength, but as a symptom of a barbaric and unenlightened society. Justice began to move behind closed doors. Executions were relocated from the town square to the quiet, sanitized confines of the prison wall, hidden from public view. This was a profound change. It marked a moment when society decided it no longer had the stomach to watch what it was doing in the name of the law. And yet, the legacy of these devices lingers. Though the breaking wheel and the rack now sit silent in museums, their specters remain. They have become cultural symbols of absolute cruelty, shorthand for the darkest impulses of humanity. They remind us that the line between order and barbarism can be perilously thin, and that the systems we build to protect ourselves can sometimes become the very source of our terror. The stories of these terrifying torture devices are more than just a grim catalog of pain. They are a reflection of a world struggling with its own demons, and a mirror that forces us to consider the nature of our own, more modern forms of justice. Imagine now a modern museum. It is late, and all the visitors have gone home. The halls are silent, empty, and dark, save for the soft, low glow of security lights. In a quiet corner, behind a thick pane of glass, rests one of these devices. Perhaps it is a scold's bridle or a set of thumbscrews. It is inert, cold, and stripped of its power. There are no screams here, no desperate pleas, no jeering crowds. There is only the profound, deep silence of history. An object of terror has become an artifact of study. Its ability to harm long since turned to dust. This is where these horrors now belong, behind glass, in the quiet of a museum, and in the pages of history. They are ghosts, and they cannot touch us. As you lie here now, in the warmth and safety of your room, feel the comfort of the present, the rule of law, the very idea of human rights, the simple expectation of mercy, these are the hard-won fruits of centuries of progress. The warmth of your bed is a world away from a cold stone cell. The quiet of your night is a universe away from the sounds of the interrogation chamber. These are the fragile blessings of our modern age, built upon the suffering of those who came before. So, sleep now. You are safe from the iron and the flame. The rack and the wheel are but shadows in a story that has long been over. The horrors of the past are only echoes now, and they are here only to gently rock you into a deeper state of rest. Let them fade, like mist in the morning sun, as you drift into peace. Let the weight of history become the weight of your eyelids, growing heavy, calm, and ready for sleep. Thank you, dear listener, for lending me your ear and your imagination for this journey into the dark. It's been a true pleasure sharing these corners of history with you. I hope you'll join me again sometime for another story from the forgotten past. But for now, I bid you good night and sweet dreams. Sleep well, and let the past fade in as the present fades out.